It started like any other trip to the store. The fluorescent lights hummed above neat rows of canned goods and snack aisles. Shoppers moved casually, pushing carts filled with weekly essentials. Among them was a man who didn't stand out at first glance, an older gentleman, wearing a worn-out ball cap with a military emblem stitched across the front. His posture was slouched slightly, the kind of slump that comes from years of carrying pain, both physical and emotional. He rolled slowly through the aisle in a basic wheelchair, navigating his way toward the freezer section. To most people, he was just another shopper. Maybe they noticed the limp in his hand or the small trembling in his fingers as he reached for a box of frozen vegetables. Maybe they didn't. What no one knew or chose to ask was the story behind the scars partially visible under his sleeve. He was a disabled veteran, someone who had once stood strong for his country, now quietly surviving in a world that often forgets its heroes. Meanwhile, a younger man entered the store, loud, restless, dressed in flashy streetwear and walking like he owned every inch of floor tile he stepped on. He wasn't here to shop. He was here to be seen. His voice cut through the low hum of the store as he spoke into his phone, laughing, mocking, spitting curses for everyone to hear. Employees glanced but turned away. No one wanted to provoke him. The shoppers kept their heads down. The man was a walking storm cloud, full of bad energy, just waiting to strike. Then, as he turned down the same aisle as the veteran, everything shifted. It's hard to know exactly what triggered it. Maybe the veteran's cart was in the way. Maybe the thug was just looking for someone weaker to push around. Maybe, and this is often the truth, cowards find courage only when the target can't stand. He said something first. Loud, sharp words hurled in the veteran's direction. Something about moving faster or getting out of the way. The veteran didn't reply. He didn't raise his voice. He simply tried to shift his chair to the side. But that wasn't enough for the thug. Without warning, he stepped forward and punched the man in the face. Hard. A sickening crack echoed off the cereal boxes and freezer doors. The veteran's head snapped back, his body collapsing slightly into the chair. Groceries tumbled to the ground. There was a gasp from a woman nearby. Another man instinctively took a step forward, then stopped himself. Frozen. The store went silent. No alarms. No security. No immediate justice. Just a coward grinning over what he thought was power. People watched. Some with disbelief. Some with fear. Some pulling out phones not to help but to film. And the thug? He stood tall like he had just proved something. Like hurting a disabled old man in a grocery aisle made him invincible. But what he didn't know, what no one in that moment knew, was who that man really was. He didn't know about the battles that man had already fought. The limbs he lost for people like him. The hours in combat. The brothers he'd buried. The uniform he wore decades ago when he was stronger than anyone around him now. And most importantly, he didn't know who that veteran's son was, or where he was at that exact moment. Because that punch, it wasn't just a cheap shot. It was a spark. The punch had landed. The sound echoed in the narrow aisle like a slap across everyone's conscience. But what followed was even louder silence. An eerie, paralyzing silence that took over the store. Shoppers froze where they stood, some halfway through picking items from shelves, others mid-conversation. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if time itself had paused. The thug stood tall, his chest puffed with artificial confidence. His face curled into a twisted smirk, the kind that feeds off fear. He looked around, daring someone to challenge him. No one did. He was feeding on their stillness, mistaking it for permission. But what he failed to understand was that silence doesn't always mean approval. Sometimes it's shame. An older woman, clutching a basket of fruit, covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Her eyes darted from the injured man in the wheelchair to the aggressor standing over him. She wanted to say something. She didn't. A teenage boy near the end of the aisle lowered his phone, unsure if filming was the right thing anymore. A father with 2 kids pushed his cart slowly away, keeping his head down, whispering to his children not to look back. One of the store employees, wearing a bright red vest and a name tag that said, David, peeked from behind the customer service desk. His expression was blank. He had seen fights before. He had broken up arguments. But this was different. This was someone hurting a man who couldn't even stand to defend himself. David reached for the phone to call security, then paused. The security guard on duty today was barely out of high school and probably wouldn't be able to do anything. So David didn't make the call. He just stood there, unsure of what to do. Aisle after aisle, the store seemed to hold its breath. People whispered, murmured. Some spoke in hushed tones. Did you see that? Is he okay? Someone should do something. But no one stepped forward. Not yet. The coward who threw the punch believed this was a victory. He had turned a public space into a stage for his cruelty. And no one stopped him. This moment, this aching pause between action and reaction was the real test. Not of physical strength, but of moral courage. How many people saw a man struck and chose to look away? How many weighed their own safety against the dignity of a veteran and decided to do nothing? Even those who didn't witness the punch felt the shift. Something was wrong. You could feel it in the air, the tension, the uncertainty, the invisible line that had been crossed. It was more than just an assault. It was a violation of every silent agreement we hold as a society, that the weak should be protected, that the old should be respected, and that those who've given more than most should never be treated like less. In that aisle, surrounded by cereals and condiments, an uncomfortable truth revealed itself. Most people don't act out of bravery. They act out of habit, fear, or self-preservation. And when those instincts take over, justice becomes someone else's job. Conscience becomes a quiet ache in the chest instead of a voice in the throat. The silence wasn't just fear of the thug. It was fear of becoming the next target, of stepping forward and being alone. Everyone hoped someone else would do it, that another shopper, another voice, another brave soul would step up and say, "Stop!" But that someone didn't come. Not yet. Instead, they watched. They waited. They whispered apologies in their heads for doing nothing. And in those heavy seconds, the coward owned the room. The phone vibrated once, then again. The Marine checked the screen and saw his father's name flash across it. But it wasn't a call. It was a message, short, fragmented, sent hastily. Store. Trouble. Hurt. No punctuation. Just urgency. The Marine was off duty, enjoying a rare quiet moment with his unit brothers at a nearby diner. A half-eaten burger sat on his plate. The laughter from just seconds before now drowned under the sharp edge of instinct. He stood up. No explanation needed. The others read the shift in his body language before he spoke a word. Within seconds, the table cleared. No confusion. No delay. That's how Marines operate. One moves, all move. They didn't ask if it was serious. They didn't need context. If one of their own had family in danger, that was all the context required. It wasn't just about one father or one fight. It was about the code they lived by, the brotherhood they had bled for, and the understanding that they show up, always. They exited the diner in a rush. 6 men, all shaped by discipline, loyalty, and war. Every one of them had seen combat. Every one of them had stood beside this Marine in the desert, in the mud, in the smoke. And now they were standing with him on civilian ground, because the battlefield isn't always marked by explosions. Sometimes it's a grocery store in the middle of a quiet town. The truck peeled out of the parking lot. No sirens, no dramatic music. Just boots on the floorboard, jaws clenched, and eyes sharp. One of them opened his phone and pulled up the store's location. Another was already dialing the store's front desk. No answer. It didn't matter. They would be there in minutes. Inside that vehicle, it wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. It was about respect. It was about making sure no man who served his country would be left helpless in aisle 5 while strangers watched. These weren't just any soldiers. These were men trained to respond under pressure, who could read danger in shadows and act faster than thought. But this time, the enemy wasn't armed with rifles or rockets. He was armed with arrogance, with the false confidence of someone who thought no one would come. The Marine kept his eyes on the road. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His mind was racing, not with panic but calculation. His father was injured, he didn't know how badly. But that didn't matter right now. What mattered was getting there. Showing up. Standing tall. Because if his dad couldn't stand, he would do it for him. And behind him, 5 others would do the same. They turned the last corner as the GPS announced their arrival. From outside, the store looked quiet. Normal. But inside, they could feel the storm waiting. The Marine's hand clenched the door handle. His brothers straightened their backs. One of them cracked his neck. Another rolled his shoulders like he was about to step into a cage. This wasn't about starting a fight. This was about ending one. And letting the coward know that you don't lay a hand on a veteran without consequence. Because when you harm one of them, you don't just hurt a man, you wake up a tribe. A family forged not by blood, but by duty. The truck came to a halt. No hesitation. No fear. 6 men, born of war, trained for chaos, stepped out. Not in uniform, but still in formation. They moved like a unit in sync without words. Because that's how real brotherhood works. You don't need a speech to respond. You just move. 7 minutes. That's all it took. Not long in most situations. Barely enough time to heat a meal or check out at the register. But in this case, those 7 minutes stretched like wire pulled taut, humming with tension. Inside the store, the veteran sat slumped in his chair, one hand clutched against his face, the other gripping the armrest of the wheelchair with white knuckles. Blood had started to dry around the corner of his mouth. His groceries lay scattered, ignored, stepped over by others too afraid or too ashamed to act. The man who struck him still lingered a few feet away, pacing, muttering, pretending to be calm, but you could see it in his eyes. He was watching the door. People whispered near the end caps, pretending to browse shelves, but really they were just waiting to see what would happen next. Employees nervously swept the same patches of floor over and over again, their eyes darting from the aisle to the exit. And still, no one stepped in. The 7 minutes following the punch weren't just filled with silence. They were filled with judgment. Judgment of the moment, of each other, of themselves. Each person was deciding what kind of witness they would be. A young girl stood near the frozen pizzas, clutching her mom's hand. She asked in a small voice, "Why did he hit that man?" Her mother shushed her quickly, her eyes fixed forward, her mouth tight with unease. A young couple near the checkout debated whether to call the police. But even that decision was tangled in hesitation. What if they already had? What if it made things worse? What if he saw them doing it? Near the back, a manager peered around the corner of the stockroom door. He had heard about the incident but hadn't yet stepped into the aisle. He told himself he needed more information. He told himself someone else would handle it. He looked down at his radio and kept waiting for a voice on the other end to say someone had taken care of it. Meanwhile, the man in the wheelchair didn't speak. He didn't ask for help. He simply sat there, his face swollen, his chest rising and falling, eyes distant but not broken. Because this wasn't his first moment of pain. But even still, the humiliation was there. Not just from the punch, but from being left alone in a place filled with people. And then, somewhere between the 6th and 7th minute, things began to shift. A set of headlights pierced the front window as a truck rolled into the parking lot. Not fast, not screeching, but with purpose. The thug noticed it first. His pacing slowed. He turned toward the front, squinting. The doors of the vehicle opened, one by one, with the sharp sound of boots stepping onto asphalt. The sound didn't echo like the punch had, but it traveled. A kind of silent warning that something was about to change. Inside, the silence grew thicker. Even those who hadn't been watching closely now turned their heads. Instinct drew their eyes toward the entrance. The air changed. Not a dramatic gust, not a shout, just the quiet pressure that settles right before a storm hits. 7 minutes had passed. And then the doors opened. The sliding doors parted with a hiss, and the air inside the store shifted like someone had cracked open a pressure valve. The thug who had delivered the punch stood stiff, eyes locked on the entrance as 6 figures stepped through without hesitation. They weren't dressed in uniform, but something about them immediately drew every eye in the room. Boots striking the tiled floor in rhythm, backs straight, faces stone cold. Not angry, not yelling, just moving with an authority that didn't need explanation. Shoppers parted instinctively. A woman pushing a stroller rolled back against the greeting card rack. A man near the register stopped mid-swipe, his card still in the terminal. The air, already thick with tension, became almost suffocating. The store, which had been teetering in fear and shame, now held its breath for a very different reason. Not because of what the thug might do next, but because of what had just walked in. At the center of the group was the Marine, the veteran's son. His face unreadable, eyes sharp, scanning, absorbing. He saw the crowd. He saw the wheelchair. He saw the blood. His jaw clenched, but his steps didn't break rhythm. The others flanked him. Men who had fought beside him, bled beside him, carried him through dust, fire, and gunfire. They walked into the suburban grocery store like it was an enemy compound, calm, direct, alert. The thug's cocky stance faltered. His feet shuffled just slightly. He tried to regain control of the moment, raising his voice and demanding to know what was happening. No one responded. The Marines didn't yell back. They didn't threaten. They didn't puff their chests like the man in front of them had done. They just kept walking. It was in their silence that the entire store understood something the thug never would. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. By the time the men reached the injured veteran, the store had transformed. Shoppers leaned against displays, peeking from behind corners, holding their breath like they were watching a moment history would remember. One Marine knelt down next to the wheelchair, checking the man's pulse and injuries with practiced hands. Another picked up the groceries from the floor, placing them carefully back in the bag. Not a word spoken. No spectacle. Just action. The Marine's son crouched down in front of his father. Their eyes met. No dramatic reunion. No emotional collapse. Just an exchange of strength. The kind passed between men who understand sacrifice. His hand touched his father's shoulder, and for the first time since the punch, the veteran's grip on the armrest loosened. The thug, now visibly shaken, tried to speak again, but his words came out thinner this time. He stuttered, backing up a few steps as the Marines slowly formed a subtle wall between him and the veteran. Not touching him, not cornering him, just standing, just being there. It was enough. No fists were thrown, no threats shouted. But the message rang louder than any siren could have. You do not touch one of ours. You do not harm the man who taught his son to stand straight, to fight for others, to respect what came before him. Because when you do, his son doesn't just come. He brings the full weight of loyalty with him. The store was no longer under the thug's control. He wasn't the biggest presence anymore. He wasn't feared. He was simply exposed, unprotected, outnumbered not by 6, but by what those 6 represented. Discipline, duty, brotherhood, a bond forged in fire that cowards will never understand. There are moments when time itself seems to bend, when a single act forces a community, a family, a country to look at itself and ask what it truly values. What unfolded in that store wasn't just about a punch. It wasn't just about one man in a wheelchair or even the Marines who came after. It was about something deeper, something older than uniforms or flags. It was about honor, about loyalty, about the silent promise that those who gave everything will never be left alone. The veteran in that aisle wasn't just someone's father. He was a symbol, a man who had once stood tall in combat boots, with grit in his voice and sacrifice in his bones. The kind of man who wore scars not for pity, but as proof. Proof that he had been there when it counted, that he had answered the call when others had looked away, that he had stood between danger and safety not for praise, but for purpose. And yet, Despite all of that, he sat bleeding in a public place while strangers hesitated, while cowards mocked, while the world forgot. That is the harsh truth that unfolded in the silence of those 7 minutes. Because honor isn't something you earn once in war and then keep forever. It's something that must be defended again and again by those who remember what it stands for. That's what his son understood. That's what those Marines understood. They didn't come to make a scene. They didn't come to retaliate. They came to restore something that had been violated, not just the dignity of one man, but the dignity of all who serve, who protect, who give more than they take. Because loyalty doesn't retire. It doesn't fade with age or injury. It grows stronger with time, like roots under the surface that others may not see until they're called upon. When those Marines surrounded the store, it wasn't an act of violence. It was an act of remembrance. A reminder that a country is only as strong as the way it treats its wounded. That strength is measured not by how loud someone shouts or how hard they hit, but by how fiercely they protect the ones who can no longer protect themselves. Shoppers who had once turned away now looked on with quiet awe. They didn't just see soldiers, they saw men who embodied something they had almost forgotten. Principles that once guided everything but had become rare to witness in action. Respect, duty, courage without bravado, justice without vengeance. Even the employees who had stayed behind their counters now stood a little straighter. One of them stepped forward with a water bottle. Another placed a call, not to security this time, but to the paramedics. A small girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Are those heroes?" The mother nodded, her voice caught in her throat, because for the first time in that store, fear was no longer the loudest thing in the room. What happened next didn't need volume. It didn't need drama, because the presence of real integrity never does. When the veteran was lifted from his chair and helped toward the door, every eye followed, not out of pity, but out of reverence. And the man who had once struck him now stood alone, smaller than ever, not because someone hit him back, but because the values he had trampled had risen in front of him, tall and unshakable. This wasn't just justice. It was legacy. The passing of invisible metals from one generation to the next. The unspoken code that said, "You may grow old, you may grow tired, but we will never let you fall, because you once stood for us, and now we stand for you,